A woman was buried a little over 3,000 years ago in Central Europe. Nobody thought her remains were special. No jewelry, no weapons, nothing to suggest she was anyone's queen or captain. But when researchers ran her upper arm bone through a CT scanner a few years ago, they found something that made them go back and check the calibration. Her humerus, the long bone between shoulder and elbow, was denser and more rigid than the arm bones of the women they'd brought in for comparison. Rowers. Actual, current, semi-elite competitive rowers. The kind of athlete whose entire job is dragging an oar against resistance for hours a day. She beat them, not by a little, almost uniformly, across the whole sample. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't an outlier buried with some warrior myth. She was, by every marker archaeologists have, an ordinary farming woman, grinding grain, hauling water, working a quernstone for years on end. That was her Tuesday. And it built a skeleton that would embarrass a modern Olympic hopeful. So here's the question that should actually bother you. If that's what an unremarkable day did to her bones, what happened to ours? Let's get one thing straight before we go further, because strong bones is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and it deserves an actual definition. Bone isn't a fixed, finished object, like a chair leg. It's closer to a living construction site that never fully stops working. There are two kinds of material we care about here. Cortical bone is the dense, compact outer shell. Think of it as the load-bearing wall of the skeleton, the part that resists bending and twisting when you run, throw, or carry something heavy. Trabecular bone is the spongy lattice packed inside the ends of your joints, like the honeycomb inside a beam that's been engineered to be strong without being solid all the way through. Both of these respond to how hard and how often you use them, following what bone biologists sometimes call the mechanostat. The skeleton has a rough internal threshold for how much mechanical strain it needs to feel on a regular basis to bother maintaining itself. Cross that threshold consistently, and it builds. Stay under it, and it starts quietly withdrawing material, the same way a company might stop staffing a department nobody's using. It's not stubbornness. It's efficiency. Bone is expensive tissue to maintain, and your body doesn't build or keep infrastructure it doesn't think it needs. Keep that word in your head. Needs. Because everything about this story is going to turn on what a skeleton thought it needed to survive its own life, not on whether the person inside it was tougher or more evolved than you. You might reasonably be wondering how anyone can possibly measure the strength of a bone that's been in the ground for 3,000 or 30,000 years. It's not guesswork, and it's not a strength test on a fossil, which obviously nobody's swinging a hammer at. Researchers CT scan the bone and pull out its cross-sectional geometry, basically the exact shape and thickness of the bone in slices, the same engineering math bridge builders use to calculate how much load a steel beam can take before it bends or snaps. A hollow tube with thick walls resists bending far better than a thin one, of the same overall width, regardless of what it's made of. Run that same beam engineering math on a Roman farmer's femur and an Olympic rower's femur today, and you get directly comparable numbers, no living tissue required. It's a strange thing to sit with. The most reliable way we have of comparing a person to somebody who died thousands of years before written history existed is the exact same physics used to make sure a highway overpass doesn't collapse. Here's where the picture gets strange. If you scan the skeletons of Neanderthals, of Pleistocene Homo sapiens, of essentially anyone who lived before agriculture, and line them up against a modern human joint, the ancient ones look like they belong to a different, sturdier species. They don't. It's the same architecture, the same genome, doing the same job, just handed a completely different workload. Researchers comparing trabecular bone, that spongy inner lattice, across a huge span of the fossil and skeletal record, found something almost embarrassing for anyone alive today. Every extinct hominin they checked, including Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens, kept lattice density as high as you'd see in a wild, physically active primate. It stayed that way for the overwhelming majority of human existence. Then, recently, genuinely recently, in evolutionary terms, it dropped sharply, only in populations living the way most of us live now. You are not descended from a frail line that gradually toughened up into whatever you are today. It's closer to the reverse. You, the outlier generation. Every single ancestor who came before the last stretch of human history was walking around with a skeleton built like scaffolding for a much harder job than yours. And if, as dense as a wild primate, doesn't land as impressive on its own, here's the version that should. A separate team spent time comparing skeletons dug up from the exact same patch of land in Illinois mobile hunter-gatherers on one side, settled farmers on the other, so climate and geography couldn't be blamed for the difference. The foragers came out with roughly 20% more bone mass than the farmers. 20% from a lifestyle change alone, same soil, same species, a few thousand years apart. The researchers didn't stop there. They pointed out that there is, in their own words, no anatomical reason a person born today couldn't reach the bone strength of an orangutan or of one of those early foragers. You read that right, an orangutan. Not because you're secretly part ape, but because a wild primate that climbs and swings and forages for every calorie is putting exactly the kind of relentless mechanical demand on its skeleton that your ancestors did and your calendar currently doesn't. So what did that daily demand actually look like? Physically, before we go further, a forager's day wasn't a workout. It was a commute with no vehicle. Covering many miles over uneven ground to find food that didn't come to you, carrying water, carrying children, carrying whatever you'd killed or dug up or gathered back to camp, in terrain that never flattened itself out for your convenience. Add in the odd stretch of literally chasing an animal on foot for hours until it overheated before you did no vehicle, no rest stop, just pursuit across open ground until one of you gave out and you get a body loaded through the hips, the spine, the legs, and the arms, in constantly varying directions and constantly varying terrain, almost every single day of its life, from childhood until whatever age counted as old. Farming physically looks nothing like that, even though it's real, hard, physical labor. It's repetitive. Instead of varied the same swing of a hoe, the same grinding motion at a quernstone, the same narrow radius around a fixed plot of land you now own, instead of a landscape you roamed across. Less total distance covered, load concentrated into fewer, more repeated motions, instead of spread across the whole body in constantly changing ways. The mechanostat doesn't care that farming is exhausting. It cares about the pattern of strain, and the pattern changed the moment humans stopped needing to walk to their food. So when did the drop actually happen? And how do we know it wasn't just a slow, even fade? This is where a research team took on something genuinely difficult. Not scanning one skeleton, but nearly 2,000 of them, spanning tens of thousands of years, to catch the moment the decline actually started. They pulled cross-sectional bone strength data essentially. How much bending and twisting force a femur or a tibia could resist from 1,842 individuals across Europe, starting in the Upper Paleolithic and running all the way through the 20th century. And the decline wasn't a straight, steady slide from cavemen to us. It had a start date. Leg bone bending strength begins its big drop in the Neolithic, right around the time farming shows up, and it keeps falling for a few thousand years after that, through the Iron Age and into Rome. The researchers zeroed in on the femur and tibia specifically because those are the bones that answer directly to how far and how often you travel on your own two legs, which meant the decline wasn't really tracking farming. As a diet or a culture, it was tracking travel radius. The moment your food source stopped requiring you to roam for it, your leg bones got the memo. Then it stops. Not slows down. Stops. No further meaningful decline from ancient Rome to the 20th century, despite everything that happened in between, despite chairs, carriages, elevators, and eventually a species that sits in front of a screen for most of its waking hours. The single biggest change to the human skeleton in 10,000 years happened when we stopped walking everywhere to find food, not when we stopped walking at all. Let's go back to the woman from the cold open, because her case is the clearest illustration of exactly what loading means in a human life, not a lab. The study that scanned her, led by researcher Alison McIntosh at Cambridge, compared prehistoric women from Neolithic through Iron Age cemeteries in Central Europe, a span of roughly 5,500 years of farming against living women with documented activity levels, sedentary volunteers, endurance runners, football players, and competitive rowers. The legs told a fairly ordinary story. Prehistoric women's leg bone strength looked a lot like modern sedentary women's, sometimes stronger, sometimes not. The arms were the surprise. For that entire 5,000 plus year stretch, prehistoric women's upper arm rigidity outdid living rowers, almost uniformly, in McIntosh's own words. Not once, not in one unusually strong burial across the whole sample, generation after generation. And it makes sense once you picture what grinding grain by hand actually costs a body. Turning a heavy stone against another heavy stone, thousands of repetitions, hours at a stretch, most days of the year, just to make enough flour to keep a household fed until the next harvest. Grinding grain by hand, it turns out, loads the upper body in a way that looks, to a bone, almost identical to years of competitive rowing. The body doesn't know the difference between an oar and a quernstone. It just knows how many thousand repetitions of resistance it survived. Here's the part that should genuinely bother you if you've ever blamed your own body on modern life. You'd expect the story to keep getting worse. Cars, desks, elevators, phones. Surely, that's when the real damage happened. It isn't. The plateau starts around the fall of the Western Roman Empire and holds essentially flat for 2,000 years, straight through the Industrial Revolution and into the age of the office chair. Whatever mechanization and urbanization did to daily life, it didn't do much of anything additional to the skeleton. At least not by this measure. The heavy lifting pun very much intended had already been done thousands of years earlier. The moment humans traded constant terrestrial movement for a fixed field and a harvest schedule. Which means the popular villain in this story screens. Cars? The modern desk job isn't the one holding the smoking gun. It's an accomplice showing up 2,000 years after the actual damage was done. If you'd asked a bioarchaeologist a generation ago to bet on where the curve flattened, industrialization would have been the obvious guess factories. Then cars, then desks. An ever-accelerating retreat from physical effort. The data doesn't cooperate with that story. Whatever damage the 20th century did to how we feel about our bodies, it didn't move the needle on how our skeletons are actually built, because that needle had already been pinned in place since roughly the fall of Rome. If you want to see this exact mechanism happening on a human body in real time, you don't need to wait for an archaeologist to dig anyone up. You can just watch what happens to an astronaut. Take away mechanical loading almost entirely, all at once, and the skeleton reacts fast. NASA's own research on spaceflight tracks it directly. Astronauts lose between 1 and 1.5% of their bone density every single month they spend in microgravity, concentrated in the weight-bearing bones, spine, hips, legs, the exact same bones that took 10,000 years to erode on the ground. A 4 to 6 month mission can put a crew member on a fast track toward the kind of fragility doctors normally associate with old age. Which is exactly why NASA lists it as one of the defined health risks of long-duration flight and why full recovery after landing can take a lot longer than the mission itself. Sometimes years, sometimes not completely at all. Put the two studies side by side and the comparison gets uncomfortable fast. Researchers estimated that what a hunter-gatherer's skeleton had in bone mass over a farmer's was roughly equivalent to what an ordinary person loses after about 3 months of pure weightlessness. Thousands of years of accumulated advantage, and modern spaceflight can erase a comparable chunk of it in a single season. Now, a responsible pause here, because it would be easy to walk away from this thinking ancient humans were simply a tougher, more heroic version of us, and that's not quite what the evidence supports either. Most of these datasets lean heavily on specific regional skeletal collections. Central Europe, Illinois, a handful of well-excavated sites, because that's where the archaeology has historically been dense and well-funded. It is not a full global picture of every forager and farming population that ever lived, and applying a Central European farming woman's arm bones to, say, a coastal forager in a completely different climate and diet is exactly the kind of leap this evidence can't fully support. There's also a genuine, ongoing debate about how much of the extreme robusticity in a species like Neanderthals reflects activity level at all, versus a cold-adapted body plan they carried, regardless of how hard they worked. Some researchers push hard on the activity explanation. Others argue body proportions built for heat retention are doing real work here too. And the honest answer is probably some of both, not a clean either-or. Bone strength also isn't a scoreboard for who would win a fight. A denser femur tells you about accumulated mechanical habit, not raw combat ability, willpower, or general toughness as a person. Skeletal collections skew toward whoever happened to get buried somewhere. Archaeologists eventually dug up, which is its own quiet form of survivorship bias. That said, this isn't purely a Europe-only story. The Illinois foragers versus farmers comparison sits on an entirely different continent from the European dataset, with a different climate, different crops, and no shared population between the two samples, and the same basic direction of effect turns up there anyway. Mobile people, denser bones. That kind of independent agreement, from researchers who weren't even working together, is exactly what makes scientists treat load-driven bone change as a real, repeatable mechanism instead of a quirk that happened to show up once in one country's dirt. If you want the honest scorecard, what's directly evidenced is the measured decline in cross-sectional bone strength across nearly 2,000 skeletons, and the measured gap between foragers and farmers on the same land. What's inferred, reasonably, is that reduced mobility and changed loading patterns are the driving mechanism, since that's the one variable that lines up with the timing every single time. What's still debated is exactly how much of any one population's robusticity comes from activity versus body plan, sex differences, or diet. And what's flatly unknown is how any single ancient individual's bones would have responded to a modern gym routine, because that experiment can't be run on someone who's been dead for 3,000 years, only on you. But here's what doesn't get weaker under that scrutiny, and actually gets sharper. This was never really a story about ancient humans being superior. It's a story about what a skeleton does when you actually use it the way it evolved to be used. That's a more useful truth than they were tougher, because it's the one you can still act on. And unlike genetics, it's a truth. NASA is already spending public money trying to reverse engineer for people who never left Earth. Which brings us to the part of this that stops being ancient history and starts being about the body you're sitting in right now. You don't actually need a dig site or a spacecraft to see the mechanostat working. It shows up in living people, right now, on a much smaller scale. Long-term tennis and baseball players routinely show measurably denser, thicker bone in their dominant throwing or serving arm than in the other one. Same person, same genes, same diet, one arm doing years of repeated high-force loading that the other arm never did. Two arms on one skeleton, quietly running the same experiment the archaeological record ran across 10,000 years, just compressed into a single career and a single body. Bone remodels. According to that same mechanostat rule biologists have studied for over a century. Load it past its threshold, and it reinforces itself. Stay under that threshold, and it quietly, efficiently lets that reinforcement go, because your body is not in the business of maintaining infrastructure it doesn't think you need. That's not a metaphor about the Roman farmer or a joke about astronauts. It's happening in your own skeleton on a rolling basis. Right now, based on what you did this week. It's a large part of why bone density loss and osteoporosis risk climb so sharply in populations that sit for most of the day. And it's also why the standard medical advice for slowing that loss isn't a supplement or a posture fix. It's weight-bearing and resistance exercise. Real mechanical load. Delivered often enough and heavy enough to convince the mechanostat it's still worth the upkeep. On Earth, that means the gym or a heavy backpack on a long walk. In orbit, it means hours a day strapped into resistance machines just to slow, not stop, the same decline your Neolithic ancestors triggered by settling down. There's also a window where this matters even more than usual, and it's not adulthood. The bulk of the skeleton you'll carry for the rest of your life gets built out during childhood and adolescence, while bone is still in an aggressive growth phase, and far more responsive to load than it will ever be again. A forager kid wasn't hitting the gym either, obviously, but a childhood spent climbing, carrying, running, and covering real distance was quietly laying down the scaffolding for exactly the kind of skeleton that later shows up in these studies, looking almost superhuman. A childhood spent mostly sitting is laying down the opposite scaffolding, and it's a lot harder to retrofit at 40 than it would have been to build at 14. The forager and the farmer weren't tougher humans wearing your skeleton. They were the same skeleton, answering a completely different job description. Yours just happens to be the first one in roughly 10,000 years that mostly asks it to do nothing at all. So picture her, again, the woman with the arm bones that would embarrass a rower, buried without a single object, suggesting anyone thought she was remarkable. She wasn't remarkable. That's the entire point. She was ordinary, and ordinary, for most of human history, meant carrying a physical workload heavy enough to build a body your gym routine can't touch. The real gap between ancient humans and us was never in the genes, and it was never in some lost heroic toughness we've since gone soft on. It was in the 10,000 small, repeated, forgettable loads a body used to carry just to make it through an average day. Trips to the well, trips to the field, trips chasing something that didn't want to be caught. Somewhere in the last couple of centuries, we built a world efficient enough to remove almost all of them, one convenience at a time, without anyone ever deciding to make that trade on purpose. Your skeleton simply believed you, and it's still waiting to hear otherwise. Everything cited here, the 11,000-year dataset, the trabecular bone research, the rower comparison, the astronaut numbers is linked below, with the actual papers, not just headlines about them, so you can go check the bone density of your own skepticism. And if there's one thing worth carrying out of this video, let it be that your body isn't broken or behind. It's just accurately reporting the century you handed it. Go load something heavy this week. See you in the next one.